Hello and welcome back to Factorio. My name is Abuck Nasty. Today's video, we are starting to conclude the production science competition that I hosted about 4 months ago. Today's video, what we're going to be covering is the competition winners, who were the best designs at each individual category, so any percent, 100%, we'll get into that later. And then we will kind of conclude by just talking about some of those designs. After this, I'm going to go through a deep dive on what made those designs better, and ultimately what are the lessons learned, so stay tuned for that. This video, we're going to be covering some of the results. So here is the benchmark results that I wound up writing up here over on my GitHub page. So if you're interested in reading this will be in the video description below. You can go and find it under my username, under Factorio Benchmarks. That's where I post all the data around all the benchmarks that I wind up doing. And if you want to support the channel, giving it a like or subscription if you like this kind of content, or even if you are so inclined, starring the repo helps out a lot as well. Anyway, with that, let's get into it. What we're going to be talking about today is we're going to talk about the round 2 stress test where we tested all the final production designs. So from this competition. So as a quick recap, since it's been a little while since I've done this, 23 individual designers created a design for this competition. There are 36 full science production designs that were tested because there were some new composite designs that got added over time as well. So, otherwise, the final things that I will go and mention here is just as a recap where we're at right now. We have gone and I have rerun all the benchmarks from round 1 and round 2 since I'm on new hardware. I'm on a 9800X3D, and also I'm running on Linux. So I wanted to just get everything back to a baseline where everything is run. So round 1 has been rerun. So if you have seen the results before, not much has changed, but the results have been updated just to qualify for that. The big difference that happens since round 1 is that all designs have surpassed the baseline, where used design, unfortunately, with the trains in the past, didn't actually surpass the baseline in the past run. Now, either there's some updates to Factorio that's made it better, or my particular hardware likes it better. Cool. Either way, all the designs move on to round 2, and we can see if there's any result differences since then. So, let's dive into that, and I'll see you in a second. Another reminder that I'm going to add here is the patch size matters a lot for these different designs. So when I created this competition, I asked all the designers to tell me what their patch size settings are. And that's also when they create the save files, they had to honor that. So back when we've originally created this, we created equivalent circular brush sizes in the editor. So whether it's a size of 18, 24, 32, 37, that's going to be the size and the radius of the brush size so that the designers knew how to kind of fit the individual, their design onto a patch and fit the miners onto it. Because a lot of designers are going to be heavily using direct insertion of mining drills. So if you're seeing this for the purposes of the explanation of this video, if you see belted stone at any percent, that means that we are belting the stone in. So that's any percent category. 100% patch size means that at least a design in if one component of their design at least requires at least 100% sized patch, and then so forth, so 200 or 600%. So those are the categories you can see. No one chose a 400% design for this particular competition. I'm going to jump right away into the competition winners, and I'm going to pull up this run distribution graph here on the left. So the reason is because it's going to be a lot easier to kind of understand what's going on here. So when we look at this overall, when we actually run this benchmark, you can see this tapering down effect. And let me bring this up so we can see it. So you see this tapering down effect that kind of happens, and then it almost flatlines here, right? So these 4 designs right here, 01 by Geist, Design 17 by Car Vortex, 22 by Warbecue, and 21 by M. Those are all very, very similar in terms of their performance. And we see that over here. These are these 4 designs that are here. These are less than 1% delta across them, across all these different designs. This is the any percent category. Right here is where there is no requirements in terms of the patch size. So this is going all the way down to the point where we are just belting in the actual materials, right? In that scenario, what that means is that we're finding here a very clear individual performance improvements that continue to come from the designs until we taper off to the best designs. We'll talk about this design category in a moment, but I want to explain that first here. The next thing is where 100% patch size comes in. This is where you're going to get a design that is going to incorporate some on-patch direct insertion. So we'll look at this design in a second, but you can see here this direct insertion of the actual, what are these called? These mining drills, right? Going in the furnaces. Cool. So that's what we're seeing here. So this is where the first category we're going to need 100%. The rest of them are going to continue to be this way. So at 100%, that's where we leave off the any percent category, following by Geist, or ending with Geist. And then we start seeing Rydberg's design, Tease's design, Eric Tea's design, Geist's design, so O2, then Mullane's design, again, more direct insertion, and then finally Akara Vortex's design. So out of the 100% category, clearly Akara Vortex wound up like taking the cake here, wound up like immediately, like very, very clearly had the best improvements. So we'll wind up talking about why that is as well. So we'll cover the 100%. Specifically, what I want to cover is the gap between Mullane and then the Akara Vortex, because I find that one pretty interesting. Then finally, this is where the 200% plus kind of category starts to come in. So you wind up seeing here that the best design of the 200% category is Thalen's 11 design at a whole update time of 626 microseconds. So just to give you kind of a scale of this graph, right? This is 1100 microseconds up here down to 600. So this is a 500 microsecond distribution. So these differences start to become smaller and smaller and smaller as you wind up going through this, right? So here at the end, literally, so we have Thalen and the end at the 600% category. This is where we shave off a few more microseconds to get this tiny little extra drop that you get for getting the 600% patch size. So right away, what you can wind up noticing just from looking at this graph, and this is where the insights kind of start coming into play, the higher and higher you go into patch sizes, there's more diminishing returns in terms of the performance benefits. The bigger benefit is going to be placement and actually finding patches that are going to be big enough to actually do direct insertion. So that's the larger improvement that you get from there. But the benefits that you wind up getting are a lot smaller as you go up. So direct insertion is definitely better. That's like very clear by this big drop off here, where you wind up seeing the improvements that come from directly inserting with mining drills. So that's like clearly the better improvement. But the interesting part is that as you go to the 200, 600% category, it kind of drops off. So we're moving now into any percent category. This is where we're belting in all the stone. So I'm going to start off here with design number 20 by Groot Opperhoofd. The main reason I'm pointing this one out is this one had one of the highest transport line update time, and I found this would be a pretty good example for what to use. There were several designs that used this that also had pretty high transport line update time, like the design number 26 by Galactica. And like if you look at both of those, the main reason is we're just using these balancers here. So initially when people wind up normally talking about like, hey, splitters are bad for UPS, they are not really. They're bad in this scenario where you're perfectly balancing between them. This doesn't look bad initially when you look at this, but let's go and I'll explain what you actually wind up seeing here. So if we wind up going into the, let's enable transport lines so we can show the transport lines. I can press F5 to go into the debug. You see how this is constantly turning on and turning off? So the blue line means an active transport line. A white line means an inactive transport line. So you're seeing these are pulsing all the time. And so just slight warning for epileptic shock. I don't know if this triggers it or not, but this is flickering a lot, so I figured I'd let you know. You can see it across all the design copies. There's a lot of that flickering going on. And even worse, what that means is these mining drills are constantly turning on, turning off, turning on, turning off, turning on, turning off, right? So how do we avoid that? Very simple. The easy way is let's get rid of this whole thing here. And instead of using a splitter, let us, or rather a balancer, let's use something like this, where we are very intentionally setting the input and the output lanes. Let's bring this back in. And you're going to notice immediately when these are getting pulled in, these are constantly active. And let's go ahead and play the game a little bit faster. And eventually, you're going to notice now a very big difference between these lanes here versus these outside lanes that are constantly turning on and turning off. So what that means now is if we trace this back to the actual mining drills as well, you're going to notice that there's already a lot less flickering going on for this compared to the inputs that are coming on up here. So if we trace this all the way back to the actual mine drills that come into this area, that means that now we have constantly active big mining drills here on the outside that are bringing items in. And the one that is on the inside lane here starts and stops occasionally. Compare that over here to these mining drills that are constantly activating on, off, on, off, on, off. And we can look at this. It's almost like one tick on, one tick off. That's a lot of just updates that are happening compared to this mining drill that barely runs. So when people say splitters are bad, it's usually in this scenario where we're talking about the transport line times and then also the entities that are downstream of it constantly having to stutter and turn on and turn off. So eliminating balancers like this is a very good thing for UPS. So that'd be the first thing that you wind up seeing that is a common pattern for ones that perform a little bit worse is the incorporation of, like a balancer, which I've used them occasionally, but I've completely eliminated in my book, in my actual Megabase. Like the Rainquest balancers are really good for routing materials between N to M things, right? But in terms of like once you get to the a point where UPS really matters, you want to just avoid them altogether. Another thing you're going to notice on this design now is that we are belting in stone, but we're also then belting stone bricks again. This design, along with another design that will load up here. So let me go and grab design number 26. So you're going to notice that both of them exhibit the same behavior here, where we're again balancing, or not balancing, but we're belting things. Even though, yes, it's great that we are clocking things and clocking the outputs, we still are transporting them along a belt, so we have double the transfers, right? So really the things that we should be optimizing for is, and the pro tips that I'll give you, are going to be try to reduce the number of transfers of things. That's like the first thing to prioritize. And so when you think about this, then here we have a transport of picking up, dropping from a mining drill onto a belt, picking up from a belt, going into an electric furnace, and then the electric furnace dropping down onto a belt again to be picked up from the electric furnace again here. So the any percent category, what you can do to optimize this is to use actual belts, and then, well, we have to belt the stone in for this category, but then directly inserting from the electric furnace into the assembly machine that also makes electric furnaces, right? So those are the things that you should kind of focus on for that. All right, so let's move on to the 4 best designs. So this is the one that has been designed by Geist. You can see exactly the things that I'm talking about here. If you look at the inputs here, you can notice how they're very, very occasionally flickering on and turning off. The transport line time, this is a design that incorporates that concept that we talked about a second ago, where there are occasional on-off, like things that are turning on and off, but it's all about how the entire design has how we're routing the actual stone belts and evenly distributing them between everything. We're doing a lot of clever things, like using a splitter to go and direct into 2 different locations. There's a slight optimization we could make, which is this, but it doesn't really matter for this particular case. So stone all flows up and then is very carefully routed, even using splitters to prioritize the lane that is getting picked up from more often, because there's an uneven kind of pull here. But you wind up seeing like the balancing is incorporated throughout the entire design and is only used exactly when necessary. And so this is also where we'll wind up seeing that we are directly inserting stone bricks into electric furnaces. And that's where that benefit kind of comes from, is leveraging more direct insertion. Sure, clocking aside, this is a pretty well clocked design in general, but you're noticing just how much more direct insertion is helping, because we're eliminating now this entire transfer here event between this electric furnace and the assembly machine here. Another thing that is common with these 4 designs is that we are using one assembly machine to craft rails and then inserting them into 2 different machines to go and craft production science. It works out because you're going to need about 80 per second or so at max that you're going to need to pull off of a belt, and that's exactly the amount of the speed that one of these legendary stack inserters can actually pull something off of a belt. As long as, and the caveat is, that you're picking up from a straight line, so that you have 16 available at all times. So when you pick up from undergrounds, it takes a little bit longer, and so you get throughput limited. So you can see here that a lot of the best designs, what they wind up doing is always picking up from a straight normal belt rather than an underground, and that makes a big difference. Not a big difference, but it's a couple ticks delta, and it can actually throttle where you would wind up needing 2 stack inserters, and then it becomes not worth it. So designing is the most important thing beyond even just like clocking methods and things. It's like designing so that stack inserters are going to always pick up better from a straight line than they are from an underground, right? But again, this is again a very well clocked design. It's going to be directly inserting, going into two different locations, and that's a common thing that we wind up seeing. I'll move on to the next design now so I can go and emphasize that again. So this design performed 0.03% worse than the previous one, which I'm going to chalk up to these are exactly equivalent. So, but you can see how different this design is compared to the design that we saw a second ago by Geist. So, very different layout and the way that we're actually routing the stone. But you can see here, it's like very intentional again. There's that same pattern where we have occasionally turned on and off transport lines, but they're nowhere near the amount of pulsing that we saw with some of the balancer designs, right? So, this one incorporates a lot more direct insertion here for the productivity modules that are going in, right? And then winds up also, again, leveraging direct insertion for electric furnaces going into the assembly machine that makes electric furnaces, right? So here's that common pattern that we're seeing again. And then, again, here, this is where, although technically this is picking up from an underground here, it doesn't make a huge difference in this particular case because of how low the actual throughput is of this item down here. So, and it's also picking up here from the exit of the underground versus the entrance, and there's a slight difference in terms of that, like where the tick timing, I think, doesn't change at all, if I recall correctly. So, but again, the main point here is double picking into both things. Because we're belting stone, we're now leveraging direct insertion as much as possible, and that's where the benefit really comes from. So in this particular design, what's interesting is that it's using an extra chain, so inserter chain. A lot of designs in this competition use this so that they could get to the magic 50 per second for these, for the actual furnaces here. And in theory, this wound up being something that we thought would have been better. Turns out, not really. The furnaces, there's no real benefit. If you use 3 furnaces versus 2 furnaces, the transfers are the same. So, in other words, this is equivalent, because there's 3 inserters here to 2 furnaces, as having 3 furnaces and directly inserting with one individually. And it actually winds up being better than a chain like this. So that's kind of a nice thing, is that we can design around that, and that winds up being a little bit different. So there's changes that we could have made in design like this, knowing what we know now. But point is, where I'm kind of going with this is, again, for the any percent category, really stressing what are, like, using your debug, checking how often these things are turning on, turning off, trying to maximize the time that the transport lines are actually inactive, and reducing the amount of actual transport lines as a whole, and then leveraging direct insertion as much as possible that you can. Next, we're moving to the 100% category. In this category, the designers had to very much keep in mind the size of a patch and design around that constraint. So as we move on to the 200% and 600% category, that's the same line of reasoning that comes about. So you have to keep it on that patch, and you can't go any larger than that. So with the 100% category, the designs are some of the most interesting because we're so space limited. So now compactness really matters, trying to get it as crammed as small as you possibly can so that you can fit it onto a 100% patch. You'll see some variations between the amount of beacons that we're using and then also the number of patches you're going to need in order to have that trade-off of having more beacons but less mining drills directly on a patch. So you'll see some trade-offs as we continue to go with this category. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about is we're starting off here with Geist's design, which is right in the middle of the results. So I'll pull those up right now. So here you're going to see Geist's design, which performs 1.5% worse than Mulane's design in this benchmark. However, you're going to notice that the electric heat fluid circuit update time, that is the multi-threading update time, winds up being disproportionately larger than than Mulane's design for Geist's. So why is that? So let's go back to the design. Here, what I'm going to point out is a kind of critical thing. So, and this is an artifact of the way that we're benchmarking things, and that's why I want to call it out. When you see all these pumps that are in here, this is going to increase your fluid update time. In an actual real save file, we don't really ever care about optimizing for fluid update time, and I'll explain why that is. So when we look at the statistics here on the left-hand side, you're going to see electric heat fluid circuit update time, MT, that stands for multi-threading, and you're going to see 3 categories. Here, we're going to have the electric network, which is going to be usually the largest amount in any save file is going to be your electric network update time. Fluid flow, in my actual Megabase save file, is about half of electric network update time. So when you calculate the overall value that's up here, it's the sum or the greater of the two. And you can see here that that's not exactly true. There's a slight increase. There's some overhead here that exists, but usually whichever one is the greater of the two is what this is going to be in a real save file. So here, the fluid flow update time being equivalent to electric network isn't realistic for a real save file. And so because of that, that actually skews the results. So let's pull up those results again. So what you wind up noticing, if you look at Geist design, you're going to see that the multi-threading update time, the EHF circuit update, that is going to be 47 microseconds in this benchmark. However, the next two designs, Mulane's and Acar Vortex, those come in at 40 microseconds. So that extra 8 microseconds or 7 microsecond increase actually winds up skewing the results to make Geist design look worse. In reality, Mulane's design and Geist design are almost exactly equivalent. So the real thing that they actually just trade off is actually control behavior update time. So that's using like decider combinators. So Geist use a lot more decider combinators compared to Mulane's design, which uses some more simpler clocks. And Geist is using like a lead follower, latching lead follower concept. So the control overhead is higher in his design. So if he had swapped them out for some other clocks, then that were a little bit more performant, Mulane's and his design would be almost equivalent, which is... So the reason I'm calling this out is that offset from the fluid flow update time is actually skewing the results enough, because when we measure this in the way that I measure these things in this competition, it winds up being a whole update time comparison. So here, that is an outlier. And so in the results section, I don't call this out. So this is something that for future competitions I need to be mindful of, and I need to think through how I'm going to measure this going forward, so that we are comparing designs and not allowing the fluid update time to be offsetting it so much for these kinds of designs. So what we'll do now that that's out of the way, what we're going to do is we'll start with Geist design and move our way progressively upwards, and we will talk then about what made Acar Vortex's design so much better than the previous designs. So starting off with Geist design, quick overview of how it works. One unique thing that he did, and this is the only design in the entire competition that did this, is a direct insertion of advanced circuits into electric furnaces. This is a really clever design that utilizes the larger hitboxes of the big mining drills to directly insert into furnaces. So you can fit on a 100% patch all the way around to get 40 per second of these electric furnaces out of here. Or actually, I take that back. We're actually getting a little bit more than that. We're getting down here, I think like 60 or so. We're getting 1, 2... Or no, we're not. We are getting 40, but we are splitting between each of these individual furnaces. So they're slightly lower update time. And that's because we just couldn't get quite the number of beacons that we wind up needing around here. We'd need at least 3 furnaces at 30 per second here to insert into here. So what it winds up being is 6 extra assemblers. So one of the things that you'll notice here, this is going to need more assembly machines, inserters, overall entity overhead in order to accomplish direct insertion for advanced circuits. Every other design wound up actually belting the advanced circuits to the patch that it needed. So with that being said, the overall thing that I will comment on here is there's a lot of patches that we wind up needing in order to accomplish this, in order for this design to function, right? So per 480 per second, you need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 individual patches. Let's go and compare that to Mulane's design. So one immediate difference that you're going to notice in Mulane's design is there are 8 patches compared to the 12 that we had for Geist. So one interesting choice in order to accomplish that is reducing the beacon count in order to fit or as kind of trying to maximize how many of the actual mining drills that we can fit on an individual patch. The high count that comes from the design difference here is not really the furnace production. It's actually just the layout for the design here. So this winds up trading and reducing the number of beacons in order to fit more on a single patch. So logistically, this is a little bit simpler to go and roll out and deploy than the design we saw a second ago by Geist. And like I said, these are effectively equivalent in terms of their overall, like, total update time. These are almost equivalent designs. And the interesting part is when we did the micro benchmarks of the furnace layouts here, we wound up seeing that this design was incredibly competitive. It was actually one of the best designs that existed. So and this is where a challenge that came out from the competition for the first time, where we said, okay, well, actually 3 furnaces is pretty good for a setup like this. So compared to everyone else who was trying to maximize and get up to 50 per second per furnace so that we could get 10 per second out of this. So here this is split 3 ways, but winds up actually being pretty good for UPS when we tested this out. Now, the difference again between Geist design and this one is that we're belting advanced circuits to go and make the electric furnaces here on patch. So one of the other things that winds up having a relatively high entity update time is having reducing the amount of direct insertion. One of the things that and using trains here for this. This was a really good design when we originally did chemical science, and this was just stacked to make 360 per second, or I think something like that, or for the advanced circuits that we wind up needing. But you're going to wind up seeing here that the advanced circuits are then also belted in to produce the productivity modules. So this is a really interesting comparison because Geist design winds up directly inserting advanced circuits, and then for producing the red circuits to make productivity modules, that design is different. So let's go back and flip back to that as a comparison. We look at Geist design again, and we look at the red circuits. Well, here, we're actually going and directly inserting the red circuits into productivity modules. However, we're using chest chaining here to get it and get a lot more beacon counts here. So what we'll do now is, now that you've kind of seen the trade-offs, and like I said, there was 8 beacons here, this is now a 10 beacon design, but needing more overall patches. What we'll do is we're going to move over to the winner of this competition for this category, so which is the design number 19 from Akara Vortex. This is Akara Vortex's design. The question becomes, how did this design perform better than the previous 2? Like we said, those are equivalent, and both of those were 4.78% worse than this design. So the question then becomes, well, where does that trade-off, or what are the differences that led up to that point? So when we look at this, what we're going to notice is that actually this is a almost completely fully DI build for productivity modules. And this design is one of the first deviations from that. Both of the other ones are doing some kind of a belting or chest chaining of productivity modules. So this directly inserts them. So there's an improvement there because we're reducing the amount of advanced circuits that we're transferring. And what we'll look at then in the comparison of these two as well is, let's look at our furnace production, because it's one of the most critical design choices that come about. So in this design, what we notice is that the direct insertion into the electric furnaces, that's all done here. And then, however, the choice here with Geist design, he needed 6 electric furnaces, but was directly inserting red circuits to make the electric furnaces here. In Mulaine's design, we belt the red circuits in. But Mulaine makes the compromise of also belting advanced circuits to the productivity module. Now that reduces the overall footprint of it drastically because we're just making one block that makes all 360 per second advanced circuits that we're going to need for the entire blade. However, the downside is then you're picking up from a belt. So there's a compromise that was made there to belt the materials. In Geist design, compared to Akara Vortex's, there was a lot of chest chaining that was going on, and the overall beacon count was much higher in order to accomplish that for the productivity modules. Now, that makes it a lot simpler to chest chain and actually clock everything, because then we don't have to worry as much about exactly buffering in hand and dealing with the automated insertion limits and overload multipliers that wind up having, because it really starts to make create a problem for these. And just directly this specific path here from the advanced circuits to the productivity modules is what tripped up most people in actually trying to clock everything. So that was the hardest thing. Tripped me up for a very long time as well. So, what else has changed? Well, an interesting thing is this science block layout is very different than, or not very different, but it kind of combines both philosophies from Geist design and Mulaine's design. What's interesting about this takes the 10 beacon concept, or almost 10 beacons, is a 10 and 8 split. So it actually compromises, does 10 beacons for the outsides, just like Geist design does, but then does 8 beacons, which was what Mullaine was doing. And so what this allows is we can fit a full 240 per second block directly on one patch, and that's because we're using the much larger hitbox of the big electric mining drills, which is a pro of them. The small electric mining drills, however, because they're much smaller, they're convenient because they can fit in the same space as a furnace. However, their hitbox, as you can see here, not the hitbox, but the mining area, is much smaller. Whereas we compare that over here to the big one, you can see just how big that mining drill area is. So we can start mining from a very, very far away from the actual patch location. So we can use it to fit on patches much more easily. That's a big pro to this design. Now, all three designs clocked the actual big mining drills, so that was a very good thing. So, where I'm coming from as I was looking at this, the assumption that I have here on why this performed better is it kind of took the two best practices from both designs and combined them into one design. So if I created a composite of Mullaine's and Geist design, we could probably come up with a very similar thing here. Because what I think Geist did really well is he wound up doing a version of direct insert for the productivity modules. Now, what brought Mullaine's design down compared to this design was the productivity modules. Them picking up constantly from a red belt to insert the advanced circuits rather than directly inserting them because of the much higher throughput rate that's here. That wound up hurting Mullaine's design. So that's where that one wound up making a compromise that ultimately hurt it in the end. That's where you can see that there's small design choices rather than clocking methods that winds up being more relevant for how these designs come about and what actually makes the trade-offs worth it or not worth it. I don't think that the 10 beacon versus 8 beacon is going to make a huge difference here in terms of the overall performance of the productivity science packs, because really the output that you're going to be dumping onto a belt is going to be very minimal in terms of like the transfer counts are going to be very much the same. I think all the way that the sauce is made is all in this component and making the best decisions here for the high flow rate items that were maximized or minimized in terms of expensive transfer counts. So picking up from a belt and intermediaries, right? So that's where this design winds up combining the best of both worlds from both of the two previous designs that we just saw, and ultimately makes it the leader of the 100% category. So moving on to 200% now, we're going to see we have a lot larger patches, right? Compared to before, where this was the patch size that we used to have for 100%, has now drastically gone up to 200% size patches. The nice thing here is the compression. We now go from 8 patches that we need, we exactly reduce it down to 4. So it kind of makes sense. So it's nice that that actually kind of translates exactly like that in terms of these different designs. Here again, we're maximizing the hitbox on here by using the big mining drills so that we can fit it more effectively on a 200% patch. Your mileage may vary actually deploying this at 200%. I still recommend that you go to 600% for everything. But if you don't like that playstyle, this may or may not fit on a 200% patch size. This was, again, the average ore size that we could find. So, with that, here's one of these layouts where you start to see now we're using a lot more of these electric mining drills over the large mining drills, and that's because just to make it much more compact and share more beacons. So at this category, we start seeing the diminishing returns. So the previous design at 100% patch size settings for design number 19 by Kara Vortex was 640 microseconds of update time. This goes down to 626, so a much smaller improvement overall. So that's where, again, this is a great design that Phalanx came up with, but you're starting to see the diminishing returns. Both have very similar design strategies in terms of how they go and produce their modules and then actually directly insert. In terms of like entity ratios and things, they're very similar in terms of optimizations. But you're starting to see that diminishing return that you get from going to the bigger patch sizes, which I thought was really interesting, that it doesn't matter as much. But the big thing I want to emphasize, although it's not showing up on the UPS benchmark, the other thing to consider is the logistics. And the logistics of having to find 4 patches at 200% versus 8 patches at 100% is a massive difference in terms of your quality of life as a engineer going and building your factory. So I would highly recommend to keep that in mind when you're actually going to choose which patch size you want to get to. Last, we step it up to the 600% category. So in this case, we need the 600% patch size setting. So if you were thinking about it this way, map gen setting, we would need stone to be at the 600%. So cranked all the way up in terms of the size, right? That's what we wind up needing to get this to work. So this is the final category. This is the absolute max that you can have in a non-editor world. And there's only a handful of designs that actually compete in this category. It wound up being the best. So out of those two, there's an almost exact tie between design number 10 that you're seeing here by Theon and a 0.2% worse performance from the design number 29 from the end. In terms of what the difference is, the whole update time of this design in front of you is 622 microseconds, and the one before that was 623. So the difference between first and second place is 1 microsecond. So I'm going to say that they are equivalent. With that being said, this is easier. This design in front of you by Theon's a little bit easier to explain the benefits that you get from a 600% patch design. So I will incorporate and explain it that way. Here, we're now stepping it down and we're having 2 lanes of output for just 2 patches. So we've reduced by half, again, the number of patches you're going to need. So we reduced logistical complexity. Now, for the purposes of benchmarking this has been conveniently put in a location where it's very close to each other, and you could, in theory, do this, but there's no reason that you couldn't just go and create a very, very long belt halfway across the map for all of the actual red advanced circuits that you're going to wind up bringing in and the other materials. Now, the nice thing about this design, if you look at this, is that this incorporates the furnace production and the rails all on one patch. So that's one benefit that you're going to get from this. Now, the difference at this level compared to the design that we saw a second ago by Theon, well, the percent difference from the 200% patch was a 1.3% worse performance by having more patches. And where that really comes from is, if we look at that, let me open this up. Let's go and find that design. So this is the previous one. So the main differences at this scale, so this is the one that we have here. Well, sorry, this is 10. Let's go and open up number 11. The difference there is now, right, we have 4 patches. This is back down to 200%. And what you'll wind up seeing is that it's really just like, at this point, you don't get to share clocks. And you could, in theory, do it by running them all over the map. I do appreciate that when Theon created this, it was a little bit more realistic in terms of how you would actually set this up by having the clocks separate on each patch, because that's actually how I would deploy it myself. And you could later on go and create a single clock that connects all of these, but this is a little bit more realistic how a normal person would wind up setting this up. That's the downside, is you don't get a shared clock, and you don't get to share, let's say, necessarily you don't get to share as many beacons, right? You can see here that there's individual beacons for this patch versus this patch, and if we switch back over to the other design, you see here that we get to incorporate now some, and I keep selecting the wrong ones. I'm so sorry about that. Let's go move over here. So this is where you get to see that now we get to share all of these beacons here that we didn't get to before. So that's kind of where we reduce the overall beacon count, and that winds up getting better. This is where the diminishing returns kind of come in. So, and also to get this all to fit on a 600% patch, we're doing some things where we're barely getting the hitbox here to actually hit the patch. So your mileage, again, may vary when you actually put this into a real save file, trying to go and get that to wind up actually fitting. But along a lot of the same principles are applying here, which winds up making this the actual optimal design that was originally submitted in the competition. And it's, again, just using a lot of direct insertion as much as we possibly can and minimizing beacon counts and sharing them as much as possible. And you can see that here, even when you're stacking two individual lanes here that are making the actual product, the advanced circuits here, the advanced circuits and the productivity modules are sharing beacons here because of the design choice to make these kind of tileable. So those are some of the main differences. Really, at this point, at this level, it's just you're purely optimizing for using less beacons. And you're also gaining the logistical complexity reduction of needing less patches. So that's the benefit that you get at 600%. But we're talking about a 1.3% delta between 200% and 600%. So really, this is where we're in very diminishing returns territory. So, but very cool design. This is also just like from a compactness standpoint. I know in a real base you wouldn't deploy this because you aren't going to have spawned like patches that are going to look like this. So it's going to be all over the map that it's going to actually get placed. So it's going to be a very different look to it. But in the next video, I'll actually showcase this in my actual base, and you'll wind up seeing how this actually looks for real. So, so stay tuned for that. We're going to have one more category we're going to touch on, and then we'll close out the video for today. So, this is a design that you came up with. Why you? He's also another YouTuber that makes Factorio content, so go check him out. I really appreciate this design. This was mainly a let's just see how bad trains are compared to, and make it actually a pretty competitive design. This is a really good design. This actually, like in the 1.0 days, was like exactly what you would wind up doing. And this is actually taking into account what we have with Space Age, with having better overall buildings and being able to utilize them, right? So this design originally actually didn't pass the baseline, and actually when I ran the second series, so for this round 2 where I did a final test at 108,000 picks for all these designs, it again performed below the baseline. So it seems like the longer the runs were taking, this is where the diminishing returns came from, and it's mainly just because of the very high train update time. Now, entity update time was also pretty high here, just because no clocking was involved, and so there's some optimizations that could be made. And so, thankfully, we actually have 2 other submissions that were created by some of the designers after actually feeling bad for you for not passing the baseline originally. So they came up with a design. So Akara Vortex wound up going and collaborating with you, and they came up with this new design. So let's show this. This is a surprise edition that came in. So this is in the honorable mentions category. So we have changed the design. We still are honoring the fact that we're using trains, and the fact that this is legendary I'll get to in a second. But, so it has nothing to do with in here. This is unmodded. This is exactly the way that trains are going to be used normally. And what we're going to see here is that this uses the design from Akara Vortex's design, where it creates the productivity modules, because it really there's no benefit to belting or to actually training materials in. So this trains in a little bit of stone, and then passes in as a proxy the iron sticks and the steel. So it's a direct insertion chain through the trains, which is really, really cool to actually look at. So this design here is like kind of mesmerizing to watch it go and run here. So we're seeing it here kind of running live here across, and we'll watch this here. Let's go and make this just for showcasing how this looks. You can see the bottom section here is for producing the furnaces. Those then get routed up on a belt here. And then over here on this side is where we're actually making the actual science. And what's really cool is this is benefiting from the fact that we have absurdly high big mining drill speed here. And you can see here that it is almost instantaneously loaded in here. This is one tick, basically, that these get loaded completely in here. So we'll pause it even and just watch it happen. So it's not yet. We'll go 1 tick forward, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So in about 4 ticks, this entire cargo wagon is loaded. That's unfortunate, though, because if these were just slightly bigger, we would need less trains that we're actually bringing through here. Right? So, in comparison to that, there's a mod that exists that we can go and say here, which we've called 31, design number 31, which is Use Revenge Q5. This is the same design that Akara Vortex and you wound up collaborating on, but it adds the Quality Wagons mod. So let me reload the game, and I'll sync the mods with it so that we can see that in action. Here's that exact same design. The only difference is that the timing on the trains have been changed, and we need less trains to as a result. But the trains actually haven't been modified. The only difference is just enabling the trains for a little bit longer. The reason is we have a much bigger cargo wagon now space. That's the reason why these train cargo wagons were all in legendary form, so that we could go and see that. So when the quality wagon mod was enabled, all these trains, cargo wagons, are now replaced. So we don't actually have quality scaling in the base vanilla game. So the question was, how much of an improvement could you get by having less train pathing and overall just having a much larger buffer to pull from inside these cargo wagons? And the difference was actually pretty shocking. So the difference that we wound up seeing from a design like this, and I'll pull this up now on the screen so that we can see it. So we've got a whole update time of 1093 microseconds. So the design that Akara Vortex and you collaborated on actually brought it down to 912 microseconds. So that means between the two of those, that is going to be already about, like, if I'm doing the math right, about a 12% worse performance for the original one. So that's already, like, 100, almost 200 microseconds that were shaved off. So by just making a couple changes and actually clocking the whole build. So that's a pretty good improvement from the vanilla game. Now, if you wound up adding the mod, that's where we saw the big, huge change that you're seeing now on the screen, where the train update time was cut. So entity time was a little bit higher, and that just may be the position of where the save was located in. I'm not exactly sure why that is. But the main thing that you're seeing here is that huge reduction in train update time. So that's where, by just having the mod enabled, there was another 100 microseconds flat that just got removed. So developers of Woob, if you're watching this, I would love to see quality scaling on trains in 2.1. It would just be such a wonderful thing to make trains slightly more competitive. They're not competitive right now, but it would be nice if they were a little bit more competitive. So anyway, so that's my request. I'd love to see trains come back. That's where you wind up seeing here. I thought this was like a very cool overall thing to look at, and in terms of what would happen if you wound up investing as hardcore as you could into trains. And I've also included this on my GitHub page so you can see these charts as well there and download the data from it. So very cool honorable mention of having some trains in Factorio. And just I'll zoom this out so that we can see all those trains running. And let's go and open up the train view so that we can see the 132 stations and 168 trains that we're going to need for... this is a lot. This is, I think it's 96 lanes of science that we're producing here, if I look at that correctly here when we test this out. And then, of course, on average, this was tested out that we make the 600 or change that we wind up needing. But there's 960 per second. There's 12 copies, so we need 691,000 per minute. This fluctuates, of course, because of all the trains, and if we actually run this at... These were all verified that they actually work. So the main thing is you're going to see here is it's going to be right around the 691, 200 mark. That's all that we're really aiming for. So it'll go up and down because of trains, right? So you'll see like a floating, but if you actually looked at it at a full hour, once it's actually completely done, you'd wind up seeing that it is a full 692, 691, 600. 691, 200 per minute. That's what we're looking for. So that's what all these benchmarks were for. So in other words, cool to see, but that's a lot of trains that you're going to need to transport this amount of material at this scale. So that's where you can see just how much material you're reducing that is getting shipped around at this scale. And there's, I think, some people out there, I'm not one that is currently producing this amount of science, but there's a couple people in my Discord that I know that are actually operating at this scale of production science. And for those that are, if I had to go and tell them that they're going to go and need 168 trains that have, oh my gosh, how many cargo wagons on this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 with 4 locomotives on the head. So 18 wagons times 168. I think that was, if I remember that right. Yep. That's a lot of trains. So, and these are also using legendary nuclear fuel, by the way. So that's expensive to run. Anyway, fun exercise. Just something that I wanted to showcase here. That's the conclusion of today's video. I wanted to take some time to talk through all the different competition winners and progressively showcase the differences at individual scales and how much that all impacts it. So hopefully this gives you a good understanding of the end of the actual competition. Now, that's not the end of this particular series, and I'm breaking this down on purpose into multiple categories or multiple videos because it is so kind of intense to talk about. So this is the conclusion of the competition winners, and if you're interested in any of these blueprints or screenshots of them, you can go to my GitHub page, you can go and see them. You can also download the blueprints of the individual designs, and you can go and check them out. So if you're at each individual category, depending on what you are interested in as a Mega Baser, you can go and find them, you can look at them, get a quick preview of them, and then download these in here. So these are always going to be available as long as GitHub continues to host stuff, so go and check that out. What are we going to do after this? So what the next couple videos that you can look forward to are going to be going through the high-level conclusions. This is where I'm going to talk about when you should directly insert, how much of a difference is that going to be, how does it benefit electric furnaces, and my general advice on what you should clock and you shouldn't clock in these builds and what looks the best. The next thing that we're going to talk about as well, in hand with that, are the composite designs. What I did was I went through and created composite designs and swapped out individual components so I could do exact A-B comparisons while leaving the rest of it all intact. And from this, I wound up actually building a blueprint book, which is currently available on my actual public blueprint page, also in the video description below. And you can go and check out and download that blueprint page, which is based off that. Again, you don't have to wait until the next video, you can just go read this, but that's what the next video is going to be about, and that's going to be focused specifically on the lessons learned from production science so that you can learn it as well and apply it to your own designs if you don't want to go and take the designs that were tested in this competition. So learn from it, and hopefully you can actually improve on some of the concepts that we created here. So that's going to be it. The final thing that I want to talk about, and this will be another video afterwards that'll be separate and dedicated for it, is I want to compare Q1 production versus Q2. So I want to compare from a quality standpoint. And just as a sneak peek so that you can actually see it, I have designed a base here where I've been testing out for quite a long time running production science directly here on Novice, and I will leave you with this image just so that you can see the sheer scale of how much production science you're going to need. With all that being said, thank you so much for watching. My name is Abuck Nasty, and I'll see you in the next video.